The wind cut sharp across the open valley, carrying with it a bite that could chill a man's bones quicker than a winter river. Snow stretched endless across the plains, broken only by the jagged line of the mountains in the distance and the smoke rising faintly from a cabin's chimney. A rancher stood alone outside his log shelter, his gloved hands gripping an axe handle, breath fogging in the air as he paused to take in the silence. He had grown used to these winters, long, punishing, and lonely, but still, the cold had a way of reminding him how small one man could feel against such vast wilderness. It was in that silence that he first heard her voice. A firm call, steady and urgent, cutting through the wind like the crack of a whip. He turned, and there she was, standing with snow at her feet, her dark hair falling loose over her shoulders, eyes bright and unflinching. She was young, no more than 22, but there was no hesitation in her stance, no fear in the way she looked at him. She belonged to the land just as much as the mountains and the rivers, and yet there was something more, something human. Raw, alive. "Rancher, I am shivering. Get in my shelter now," she said, her voice carrying with a certainty that left no room for question. For a moment he only stared, half certain the cold had gotten to him and he was imagining her figure against the snow. Neighbors were rare out here. To see another soul, much less her, felt almost like a dream. She was Apache, her family living farther down the valley, known for their resilience and their proud way of keeping close to their traditions. He had seen her before at a distance, carrying water from the stream or riding bareback on a horse across the ridges, but never this close, never with eyes fixed straight on his. Her words struck him harder than the wind. Not just the request, but the boldness in the way she gave it. Most people softened their tone around him, cautious, as if unsure how a rancher who lived mostly in silence might respond. But she did not flinch. She spoke like someone who understood the weight of survival, someone who would rather command than beg. He leaned the axe against the wall of his cabin, snow crunching under his boots as he stepped closer. He could see the flush of her cheeks from the cold, the faint tremble in her hands, though she held her chin high. She wasn't dressed for such weather, at least not by his standards, and the thought of how long she had been walking out there clawed at him. Still, he wondered what drove her here, why she would come to him of all people, and why she would offer her shelter instead of simply seeking his. The land did not often give answers quickly, and neither did she. He studied her face, searching for signs of fear, but all he found was resolve. Something stirred in him then, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fur-lined coat on his back. He had told himself many times he was content with the silence of his ranch, that the only company he needed was the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his horses breathing in the barn. Yet in that instant, he felt the weight of his solitude more than ever. Her presence was like a spark against the frost. "You ought not to be out here alone," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, hint of a smile ghosting at the corner of her mouth as if she'd been expecting him to say it. "Neither should you." The words caught him off guard. He felt something shift, as though the ground itself had tilted beneath him. She was not here by chance. No, this was something more. He followed her gaze toward the mountains, their peaks swallowed in clouds. Storm was coming. He could see it, now in the heavy gray sky and the restless sweep of the wind. If she was inviting him to her shelter, it wasn't out of politeness. She knew the danger of what was about to break over the valley, and she wasn't about to leave him to face it alone. Still, questions burned inside him. Why risk herself for him? Why speak with such urgency, as though his safety mattered as much as her own? The rancher felt his heartbeat drum faster against his chest, a rhythm too strong to ignore. He had lived through blizzards and droughts, through nights when the wolves cried so near it seemed they breathed at his doorstep. He had endured hunger and silence and endless work that left his hands raw. But none of that compared to the storm now stirring within him at the sight of her standing there, waiting for his answer. Her words echoed in his mind. "Rancher, I am shivering. Get in my shelter now." It wasn't just a plea. It was a command, shaped by necessity, but beneath it, he sensed something unspoken, a thread pulling them together in the midst of the winter's cruelty. The snow began to fall heavier, flakes catching in her hair and melting against her skin. She did not move, did not waver. She simply watched him, her breath steady, her eyes challenging him to step forward. For the first time in years, he felt the world shift around him. He had been bracing himself against loneliness, against the relentless bite of the cold, against the silence that seemed endless. But here she was, breaking through it all with nothing more than her presence and her voice. Something told him that if he followed her into that shelter, nothing would be the same. And yet, with the storm gathering, and the fire in her gaze, he wondered if he had any choice at all. The wind roared louder, as though urging his decision. And he found himself caught between the safety of his cabin and the unknown warmth of what waited with her. He stepped closer, his breath hanging heavy in the air, his hand brushing the doorframe of his cabin as if anchoring himself one last time. She did not move, but her eyes followed him, steady and certain, as if she already knew what he would choose. The storm cloud split with a low rumble in the distance, and he felt the weight of the moment press down on him. The land was unforgiving, and yet, in her command, in her presence, there was something that felt almost like hope. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The snow thickened, the storm closing in, and in that breathless silence between them, everything hung waiting. The storm moved across the mountains like a living thing, rolling down with a weight that pressed against the earth. The rancher felt it before the first blast of wind tore against his coat, before the snow began to fall thicker, faster, covering his tracks. He looked at the woman standing before him, her dark eyes steady, her shoulders squared against the cold, and knew she had spoken truth. Staying outside much longer would be a mistake. He could hear the storm's warning in every sound of the valley, the rattling branches, the distant echo of a tree cracking under the strain of ice. Yet it was not the storm that unsettled him most. It was her presence, so close, so certain, commanding him with a voice that carried no fear. He had seen Apache women before, had crossed paths at trading posts and gatherings when their families sometimes came into town. They were known for their strength, their discipline, their fierce loyalty to their people. But he had never been drawn into the life of one until now. She was young, only 22, but there was wisdom in her gaze, the kind that comes from living close to the land, where every season was a lesson, every storm a teacher. She carried herself like someone who knew hardship yet refused to bow to it. The rancher shifted, glancing back at his cabin, its door still half open, the faint glow of the fire inside flickering like an invitation. He had built that shelter with his own hands, every log cut and stacked, every stone placed in the chimney. It was his pride, his safety, his small fortress against the wilderness. Yet the thought of turning back into it now felt strangely heavy. She was asking him to leave that safety behind and follow her into a place unknown. Something in her words told him that stepping into her shelter meant stepping into more than just four walls against the cold. "Why me?" he asked at last, his voice low but sharp against the wind. For a heartbeat, she said nothing. The snow swirled between them, settling on her hair, clinging to her lashes. Then she lifted her chin, her voice steady. "Because I saw your smoke, because I knew you would not turn away, and because the storm will not forgive you if you stay alone." There was no tremor in her words, no sign she doubted what she said. She was certain, and her certainty pulled at him in a way he could not explain. He thought of the winters past, of nights when he had sat by his fire, listening to the wind howl, telling himself he needed nothing more. He had built his life on self-reliance, on the belief that no one else could be trusted to keep him safe. Yet here stood a woman who did not ask for trust, but demanded it with a strength that cut through his defenses like a blade. He found himself moving before he had fully decided, his boots sinking deeper into the snow as he stepped closer to her. Her eyes flickered with something recognition, perhaps, or approval, but she did not speak again. She only turned, her steps leading away from his cabin, her footprints quickly swallowed by the storm. He followed. The wind howled louder as they moved, biting at his face, pulling at his coat. The snow grew so thick he could barely see more than a few feet ahead, yet she pressed on without faltering, as though she knew every curve of the valley, every hidden trail beneath the drifts. He tried to keep his thoughts steady, but questions pressed at him. Who was she, truly? Why had she come to him? What waited in that shelter she spoke of with such urgency? Her pace was strong, but he noticed the faint tremble in her shoulders, the way she pulled her thin wrap tighter against the cold. She was young, but not untested. The cold spared no one. And yet, she walked as though she belonged to it, as though the storm itself would bend before her will. They moved for what felt like hours, though time was hard to measure in the storm. The valley stretched endless, white and unforgiving, and he felt the weight of every step. His thoughts turned to his horses, to his fire, to the safety of the cabin now far behind. Each memory tugged at him, but each time he looked at her figure ahead of him, something stronger pulled him forward. Finally, through the blur of snow, he saw it. A shape rising low against the ground, logs stacked in careful balance, smoke curling faint from its chimney. It was smaller than his cabin, but there was a warmth in the sight of it, a promise that reached through the storm and steadied his steps. She slowed, glancing back at him as they neared. Her face was flushed from the cold, but her eyes burned with the same resolve as before. "This is my shelter," she said, her voice low but firm. "Here the storm cannot touch us." He studied the structure, the care in its build, the faint glow of firelight seeping from the cracks. It was not the kind of place a man stumbled into by chance. It was deliberate, hidden, waiting. She opened the door and stepped inside without hesitation. He lingered at the threshold, the storm clawing at his back, the warmth spilling faint against his face. Something deep inside him whispered caution, warning him that once he crossed that line, there would be no turning back. Yet the cold pressed harder, and her presence pulled stronger still. He stepped in. The warmth struck him at once, filling his lungs, softening the sting of the cold. The fire burned bright in the center, smoke rising through a vent above. Skins and furs were laid along the walls, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and pine. It was not like his cabin, but it was alive in a way his had never been. She closed the door behind him, shutting out the storm. For a moment, they stood in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them. He felt the weight of the moment settle heavy in his chest. He had walked away from everything familiar, everything he had built, and stepped into something unknown. She moved toward the fire, kneeling to stir the logs, her hands steady though her shoulders trembled faintly. The light painted her face in soft gold, shadows dancing across her features. He watched her, questions crowding his mind, yet none seemed ready to leave his lips. She glanced at him once, her eyes catching his, and there was something there he could not name. Something that spoke of storms greater than the one outside. Storms of the heart, storms of fate. "You think this shelter is only wood and stone," she said, her voice calm but carrying weight. "But it is more. It is where paths cross, where choices are made." The rancher felt the fire's warmth against his skin, but it did little to ease the chill running through him. He had thought himself hardened by solitude, untouchable by the world beyond his ranch. Yet here, in the glow of her shelter, he felt the walls of his life bending, breaking, reshaping into something he did not yet understand. Outside, the storm raged on, pressing against the walls, howling in fury. Inside, the fire burned steady. The woman's gaze unyielding, her words echoing in his chest. He did not know what fate had carried her to his door, nor what storm awaited them beyond this night. But he knew one truth with a certainty that shook him more than the cold. His life was no longer his alone dot, and as the firelight flickered across her face, as the storm clawed outside with no sign of mercy, he wondered what choice he had truly made when he followed her here. The night stretched long before them, heavy with questions, with silence, with the weight of something yet unspoken. The rancher sat near the fire, his eyes fixed on her as she moved with quiet purpose. And though the storm battered the valley, the greater storm was only beginning to rise between them. By dawn, the storm had quieted to a tight whisper, a hush that felt watchful rather than kind. The rancher woke to the soft scrape of a wooden ladle against the small iron pot. She was already moving, hair braided close, shoulders wrapped in a warm shawl that smelled faintly of sage. Steam curled up, and the shelter gathered the scent of broth and roasted corn. He sat up slow, trying to fold his large frame into the small space without knocking anything over. She looked at him once, not surprised he was awake, and handed him a cup. "You will need strength," she said. The storm hid more than wind. He drank. It burned in a steady way and set his hands to warming. He watched her in the firelight and felt the press of questions that had drawn tight around him during the night. He had chosen to cross the line into her world, but he still did not know why she had asked him. He had a ranch to mind, cattle to check, the creek to watch for. Ice. Also, there was the trail from town that cut across the North Ridge, and men used it when they wanted things easy. He had learned long ago that winter made people desperate as much as it made them quiet. "What do you mean, hid more than wind?" he asked. She stirred the pot once more before answering. "Tracks will be gone. Signs will be covered. The storm takes footprints first. It helps those who do not wish to be known." He set the cup on the floor and felt a fresh unease. "Men? Man. Or something sent by men," she said. "My uncle saw riders near the mouth of the valley last week. They watched the riverbed, then the ridge, then the smoke from your cabin. They did not come to trade." The rancher felt a cold that had nothing to do with the air. He had noticed small things in recent weeks. A fence slat pushed loose. A broken branch near the grazing line that hadn't fallen on its own. But he had told himself the land was busy with elk, that the wind worked mischief when it pleased. Now he pictured strangers riding slow and careful in the trees, counting posts, measuring distance. "Why the smoke from my cabin?" he said. "It tells them you do not have others with you," she answered. "They counted your horses too. They are the kind that keep lists." He stood and paced a step to the door, then back. The shelter was snug, but his thoughts made it feel tight. He had no blood feuds, no debts, no quarrels with the law. But land had a way of drawing trouble even when a man asked for nothing from the world. People with papers and people with pistols both came when a valley looked soft enough to take. He glanced at the fire and then at her hands. They were strong, scarred a little, steady in a way that made him feel steadier too. "You brought me here for that," he said. "To keep me out of their path." She met his eyes. "I brought you because the storm came fast. But I also brought you because you would try to meet trouble alone. The valley will not let you do that anymore." It was the kind of sentence that slid into a man's bones and stayed there. He sat back down, the cup in his hands again, though he did not drink. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "My mother's brother traps near the ridge and listens near the trading post," she said. "He hears talk." He saw a wagon that carried surveying rods in a map case. He saw white flags tied to willow branches near the riverbank. That is a company way. They set small marks. Later they come with bigger claims. The rancher felt the ground tilt the same way it had when she first spoke to him in the snow. He had been careful about the river. In spring it braided and moved, and he'd always kept his fence back far enough to let it run. He paid his taxes in town, kept his deeds tucked in a tin box, and minded his business. But he had seen how paper could pull a man out from under his own roof. He also knew how some folks talked about Apache land, as if people who had lived in the valley longer than anyone were a rumor to be erased by scribbles on a page. His jaw tightened. "What does your family plan to do?" he asked. "Watch," she said, "and choose the moment that matters. If we speak too soon, we tell them what we know. If we wait too long, the marks will be many." He nodded. Waiting was a tool, but waiting cut two ways when other hands were busy in the snow. He felt the pull of his horses, his cabin, and the trail he needed to ride. He also felt a second pull, quieter but strong, toward her. Not only because she had helped him through the storm, but because she had named a danger he had been trying not to see. She moved with an ease that told him she had lived a long time in the space where patience and action pressed against each other. They stepped out near noon, the snow bright as new tin and the sky hard blue. The mountains looked close enough to touch. The world carried a clean sound as if it had been swept. The shelter stood half buried and would be again by night, but it felt rooted like a stump that could not be burned out. She walked ahead, and he followed her narrow path toward a stand of firs. When they reached it, she crouched and brushed away a careful patch of snow with the back of her hand. On the frozen ground lay a scrap of cloth. It was the corner of a flour sack printed with a town merchant's mark. Next to it, a faint square pattern where a crate had rested, and a short curl of wire that looked like something from a fencing spool. They camped light, she said. They did not cook. They did not sleep. They set something down and moved it. He studied the square. It was too neat for woodcutters, and the wire had not blown here by chance. He straightened and looked north, toward the edge of his property line. The creek curved there, then widened by the gravel bar where he watered the horses in spring. If a company man wanted to decide a claim, he would go to a place like that. "I should ride to the cabin," he said. "I need my papers. I need to see if the lock has been pried." She shook her head. "Not yet." The storm made the road soft. "Tracks will show what was done. If we go first, we stamp them out." He tried to resist the truth in that, but he could not. He had learned to read the ground as if it were a slow book, and she was asking him to let the first pages settle. He felt his temper rise and tried to smooth it with breath. She watched him without heat, and that helped. "We can circle the ridge," she said. "Come down on the side where the wind drifted less. Your barn sits lower. If someone went there, the drift would have caught the west wall and left a line. We can see without leaving our weight." They began moving again, silent but for the crunch of packed snow. He found himself falling into her rhythm, stepping where she stepped, testing where she tested. As they climbed, the valley opened below, white and bright, and the thin ribbon of the creek shone like cut glass. He knew this land by heart, yet walking it with her changed the way he saw it. She pointed out small things that he had learned once and then let slip. A hawk feather tied high in a willow to mark the last good fish run. A notch in a stump to tell a cousin where a rabbit snare was set. Small human signs that said a place was lived in, not just owned. They reached a ledge where a man could lie flat and look down over his own life without being seen. From there, the ranch came into view. The cabin roof wore a heavy cap, but the chimney still stood sound. The corral was half buried, its rails shining where the snow had slid away. The barn leaned, as it always did in winter, like a tired horse. He felt something ease inside him when he saw it. Then the ease vanished. A dark line cut across the yard behind the barn, straight and clean, like the edge of a board dragged through powder. "Someone pulled a sled," she said. He swallowed hard. "Not mine." "Too narrow for a feed sled," she added. "Too neat for scrap hauling." They carried something in, then out. They stayed prone for a long minute. No smoke rose from the cabin. No figures moved. The cold in the rock seeped through his coat. The rancher wanted badly to run down, to throw open the door to see with his own eyes what had been taken. But the same caution that had kept him alive more than once told him to keep still. "Riders," she said, voice low. He followed her line of sight. 2 dots on the far trail, moving at an easy walk, heads bent as if the men were just out for air. They looked like cowhands from town at that distance, nothing more than figures on the white page. Yet, as they neared the bend that would show them the yard, they didn't turn their heads to take it in. They kept their eyes forward like men who already knew what lay there. The rancher felt heat rise through the cold. "They are not checking on you," she said. "They are checking on what they left." The riders vanished behind a hill. The rancher breathed out the tightness and found his voice again. "I want to know what they carried," he said, "and what they signed." "You will," she answered, "just not from them." They backed away along the ledge and cut toward a narrow draw that held a frozen trickle of water. There she stopped and pried up a flat stone. Under it lay a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She glanced at him and then unrolled it with care. Inside lay 3 things: a strip of rawhide marked with charcoal lines, a tiny bone whistle hung on a thread, and a folded paper with rough edges. She offered him the paper first. He unfolded it and felt his throat tighten. It was his brand, sketched well enough to recognize, and beneath it someone had scrawled a date and a line that made his hands go cold. "Brand recorded for parcel. Measuring North Creek to Gravel Bar." He lifted his gaze. "Where did this come from?" "My uncle found it near the White Flags 2 days before the storm," she said. "He brought it to me because he did not want it seen by others in town. Sometimes news is safer in a small circle." The rancher looked again at the writing. The letters had been made by a careful hand trying to hurry. The words carried the smell of an office, not a campfire. It was the style of a man who believed that once ink touched paper, the world must accept what it said. He set the page down and touched the rawhide strip. Charcoal lines crossed it in short bars and angled marks. She reached for it and, with a patience that made him feel steady again, showed him the code. Bars for paces, angles for turns, small dots where a willow stake should be driven. He saw his creek described by someone who had not loved it. "What is the whistle for?" he asked Dot. She held it to the light. "For calling a friend you cannot name loud. It is a signal for those who do not want words to carry." He tried to hand it back, but she closed his fingers around it. "Keep it," she said. "If you hear one at night, you will know." They spent the rest of the afternoon working from shadow to shadow, gathering small truths the storm had not erased. A knot of straw near the corral gate that wasn't his. A nail head in the snow beside the porch, more square than any he used. A shallow scrape on the barn sill where iron had bitten wood. Each sign pulled a thread in him. He thought of the hours he had spent cutting that sill and planing it smooth, of the nights he had slept so near that wall he could count the creaks when the wind turned. Someone had set a foot on that sill, and that meant someone had put a hand to the latch where his own hand had rested every day. They returned to her shelter as the light thinned. The sky turned the color of blue steel. The fire took a little coaxing before it caught, and when it did, the whole place softened. He could feel tiredness in his bones, but a sharpness rode right along with it. They ate in quiet. After a time, he spoke. "Tell me about your family," he said. "I want to know who stands with you." She gazed into the flames for a long breath. "My mother keeps the winter camp by the river behind the cottonwoods," she said. "My uncle watches the ridge and listens at the trading post. 2 cousins hunt on the east slope when the deer come down. We talk by signs. We keep our words close. Some of our people stay farther south now. They do not come to this valley as much since the new roads cut through the pines. Those who remain know every spring and every animal path. We know which stones ring when you strike them and which go quiet. We will not be pushed from a place where our grandparents are buried." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The conviction in it filled the shelter more surely than the fire. He nodded. "I am one man," he said, "but I am stubborn." "I know," she answered, and the corner of her mouth bent with the faintest smile. "You have been stubborn since the first time I saw you mend your fence in the rain when you could have waited for sun." He looked at her, surprised. "You watched that?" "I watch more than you think," she said. "I saw you leave bread for the trapper's old dog when you thought no one would see. I saw you ride to town with your hat pulled down when the judge came for taxes, not to hide, but because you do not like to look a man in the eye unless you must. I know the way your shoulders settle when you are preparing to lift something heavy. You are steady. But steady men sometimes believe they can carry too much alone." He felt a warmth that the fire did not explain. He had been looked at before, by traders, by cattle buyers, by folks in town who measured him the way they measured any man. But this was different. She had seen small kindnesses he had not meant to show. She had also seen his stubbornness and did not scold it away. She had simply set her own steadiness beside it. A low sound drifted through the wall of snow outside. It was faint, then sudden, then faint again. The rancher went still. She lifted a hand for silence and moved to the door. He followed, his breath held tight in his chest. The sound came once more. Not a wolf, not a branch. A thin, careful tone that slid through the cold like a thread. She looked at him, and he understood. The whistle died. She did not open the door. She pushed back a small wooden plug near the sill and leaned close to the gap. He could not see her face, but he could feel every nerve in the air between them. The tone came once more, short and clipped. A pattern. She waited, then reached for the hearth and picked up a small tin lid. She tapped it 3 times with a spoon. Soft and quick. The shelter went quiet again. "What did you say?" He whispered. "Not yet," she answered. The person outside must show the second sign. They stood without moving. The fire crackled, and the winter pushed at the walls. A long minute passed. Then a single light appeared between the firs. It glowed, blinked out, then glowed again, saving fuel as if the flame were precious. Once, silence. Twice, silence. 3 times in a row. She lowered the spoon. Her shoulders eased 1 notch. "It is my uncle," she said. "He comes only when the river speaks of trouble." She opened the door a crack, and the cold slid in like a blade. A figure stepped from the pines, wrapped in a heavy robe, face lined by wind and years. His eyes were sharp and bright. He stepped into the firelight and gave a small nod to the rancher, not unfriendly, not trusting, simply marking the fact of him. The rancher nodded back. The uncle spoke, voice worn by winter. "The flags are many now," he said, "and there is a new mark on the willow by the gravel bar, a stamped seal that shines when the light hits it. Men from town will be here within days. They will carry more paper than rifles. They will say their words in a way that sounds like mercy, but it is not." The rancher felt his fists draw tight. "What do they plan?" The uncle's gaze did not waver. "They plan to draw new lines that cut the valley, like a saw. They will offer coin for some and thread for others. They will say that the river moved and so did the claims. They will say the winter made it urgent. They will say a rancher must be grateful for a chance to sign quickly. The woman's eyes met the rancher's across the fire. Something passed between them that had weight and shape. He thought of his tin box. He thought of the rawhide map. He thought of the mark on the willow that shined. "We will not sign," she said. "We will not," he answered. The uncle turned the small whistle over in his hand. "There is one more thing," he said. The men with the map spoke another name while they warmed themselves by the wagon. They mentioned a buyer from far off who will not ride here, but who will own here all the same. They said he will come once the snow is thin enough to show where the river wants to live. They said the buyer already picked the place where his house will sit, and it is not on land that belongs to him. The rancher felt something old and hard rise up inside him. He had fought hunger and storms and the ache of long days. He had not yet had to fight a shadow with money in its pockets. He looked at the woman, then at her uncle, and knew the shape of the main conflict at last. It was not only the winter, not only the riders, not only the paper. It was a hand reaching from far away to lift whole pieces of the valley and set them down with a new name. The uncle pulled a folded object from inside his robe. He opened it, and the firelight struck metal. It was a small badge with a crest he did not recognize and a strip of ribbon stained with wet. The older man set it on the floor at the rancher's boots. "I took this from the sled track by your barn," he said. A man dropped it when he turned. "It smells of oil and office ink." The rancher crouched. The crest was a compass ringed in laurel, a company seal. He looked up, and the shelter seemed to grow smaller, the air tighter, the fire brighter. "They have already been inside," he said. "They have," the uncle answered. "And they will come again." The fire cracked, and ash lifted and fell. Outside, the wind started up once more, as if the storm had only paused to listen. The woman set her hand on the rancher's sleeve. He did not pull away. In that quiet touch sat an agreement he had not had to speak. She would stand. He would stand. The valley would not be measured without reply. They did not sleep much. Plans moved like horses in a corral, circling, nudging the rail, waiting for a gate to open. When the uncle left near midnight, the whistle signal faded into the pines, and the shelter settled into a taut calm. The rancher lay awake and watched the fire draw thin lines of light across the roof beams. His mind walked the fence posts and the creek and the gravel bar. It also walked the path between his cabin and this shelter, a path that was new and already necessary. Near morning, when the embers glowed low, a knock broke the hush. Not the whistle, not the uncle. A slow, deliberate knock that sounded like knuckles practiced at doors. The rancher and the woman looked at each other. She moved first, every motion quiet, every breath counted. He reached for the badge on the floor and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Rancher." A voice called from outside, smooth and polite. "We were told you might be sheltering with a neighbor. We have a letter for you and a matter to discuss." The rancher glanced at the woman. Her eyes were steady. The knock came again, soft, patient, certain. The firelight wavered on the door, and all the questions they had carried through the storm gathered there in the wood. She lifted the wooden plug and placed her eye to the gap. Her breath slowed, and she leaned closer, listening not only with her ear but with the whole of her stillness. The voice outside spoke once more, friendly like a man who sells warm blankets in winter. "We will not take much of your time," the voice said. "We only need a signature, and then you can get back to your day." The rancher could feel the land itself waiting, as if the creek had paused under its ice. He reached for the latch, but he did not lift it. Not yet. The woman's hand hovered an inch from his arm, not stopping him, only reminding him there was more than one way to open a door. He took a breath that tasted of smoke and snow. The knock came a third time, wrapped in patience that sounded like power. The winter held to the walls, the fire to the hearth, and the valley to its secrets. And on the other side of that door, the shape of the trouble they had named waited to show its face. The knock lingered in the air like a slow drumbeat, measured and calm, yet heavy with meaning. The rancher's hand rested on the latch, but he did not move it. Behind him, the fire cracked, throwing light across the rough walls of the shelter. Outside, the voice waited in the snow, carrying an edge of courtesy that felt sharper than steel. He could sense the weight of paper in that man's coat, the kind of paper that could carve deeper than any blade. The woman leaned close, her whisper barely more than breath. "Do not open. Their words are nets. Once you step into them, you will not leave without losing something." He nodded, though his chest ached to act. He wanted to see the face that belonged to that calm voice, wanted to know who dared speak as if the valley could be signed away with ink. But the memory of the badge in his pocket steadied him. These were not neighbors stopping to share a cup or check for storm damage. These were men who had already crossed his land without asking, men who moved with confidence because someone powerful stood behind them. The voice called again. "We know you are inside. The cold is no good for either of us. Let us step in, warm ourselves, and talk like men of reason." The woman shifted her gaze to the fire. Her uncle's words still echoed between them. Flags on the river. A stamped seal that caught the light. A buyer far away who would never smell the snow of this valley yet would own it by lines drawn on a page. The rancher clenched his fists and stepped back from the door. Silence followed, stretched so thin he thought it might break. Then came the scrape of boots on ice, slow steps circling the shelter. The sound of men walking, one dragging the heel of his boot so the rhythm was uneven, deliberate. They wanted him to hear, to imagine their numbers. The rancher held his breath. The woman pressed her palm against the wall, eyes closed, counting the distance of each step. "They brought 3, she whispered. "One stays by the horses, 2 walk close." The footsteps stopped. One of the men laughed, not loud, not careless, but in a way that carried mockery. "We'll be back at first light," the voice said. It would be wise to be ready then. The company does not wait long for answers. The crunch of snow faded, replaced by the faint jingle of bridles and the muffled snort of horses. The sound moved away, swallowed by the wide dark of the valley. Still the rancher did not breathe easy. He knew this was no end. It was only a pause, a reminder that the real storm had not yet broken. He turned to the woman. "At first light they come again. What will we do?" She bent to the fire and laid another piece of wood. Sparks jumped like fireflies, catching the air with fleeting brightness. "We prepare," she said. "We gather what is ours. And we show them the valley is not empty." Sleep did not come. The night stretched long, every sound outside louder than it should be. Wind pressed at the walls, branches snapped in the cold, and the distant cry of an owl carried like a warning. Rancher lay with his coat on, his hand close to the badge in his pocket. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw strangers marking lines across his land, across her family's camp, across graves older than any paper. Near dawn, a whistle broke the stillness, short, then long. Her uncle. She rose and answered with a tin lid, soft taps that blended with the sigh of the fire. Soon the old man stepped inside, his shoulders heavy with frost, his breath ragged. He did not sit. "They set camp by your creek," he said. 4 wagons, men digging holes for posts. They hang lanterns though the day is bright, so no shadow hides their work. They mean to stay. The rancher stood, anger tightening his chest. 4 wagons? They work already? Without even showing me their papers? The uncle's face was carved with years, but his eyes burned clear. "Their papers are not for you. They are for judges who will never set foot here. They act first and let the law trail behind." The woman's voice was calm, though her hand trembled on the edge of the pot. "If they plant posts by the creek, they claim the water. Without water, your cattle cannot live. Without water, our camp cannot stay." The rancher felt the weight of those words. Water was the valley's blood. Whoever held it held everything. He thought of the gravel bar, of spring floods carving new channels, of the way he had built his fences back so the river could breathe. Now men who had never seen a thaw were driving iron into frozen ground, saying with each strike that the land was theirs. "We must go," the uncle said, "before the sun rises high. If we wait, their work will be too deep." The rancher grabbed his coat and hat. His rifle leaned by the wall, but he hesitated. This was not yet the moment for rifles. Not yet. He tucked the badge deeper into his pocket and followed the others out into the brittle morning. The valley stretched wide, the snow catching fire from the first red streaks of sun. Their breath steamed as they moved through the trees, careful, quiet. Each step brought the sound of hammers clearer, a steady ring against wood. Then came voices, clipped with authority, words he could not make out but could feel in their rhythm. Orders dot from the cover of a ridge. They looked down. The creek glimmered, narrow under its ice, and beside it stood men in coats with brass buttons. 4 wagons circled like a fort, wheels frozen half in snow. Horses pawed the ground, tails flicking. Lanterns swayed from posts, yellow in the weak light. And everywhere men worked, driving stakes, stringing wire, unrolling scrolls of parchment to match against the land itself. The rancher's jaw locked. He saw his barn roof in the distance, small and fragile compared to the bold sprawl of the company's camp. These men were not waiting for his answer. They had already decided it for him. One of the men lifted a sheet of paper high, calling out something to the others. Laughter followed, harsh and quick. Another man planted a tall stake wrapped with white cloth into the bank of the creek. It stood like a flag, claiming what had never been theirs. The woman's hand gripped his arm. Her eyes were fixed on the post, but her voice was steady. They strike at the heart first. They do not test the edges. He could feel his pulse thundering. This was more than trespass. This was theft dressed in ceremony, a quiet invasion carried out with ink and iron. He wanted to storm down, to tear out the posts with his bare hands. But he felt the weight of her grip. They could not throw themselves into the open, not yet. Uncle crouched low, eyes sharp. We show them they are seen. Not today with bullets, but with signs they cannot erase. The rancher drew a long breath, tasting iron and smoke on the air. The stake stood bold, but the valley had eyes of its own. Every tree, every ridge, every shadow held witness. He thought of his cabin, of the tin box of deeds, of the whistle in his pocket. He thought of her family, waiting by the cottonwoods, knowing that if the water was taken, their home would vanish 2 below. One of the men turned, scanning the ridge. For a moment, the rancher thought their cover was broken. The man stared long at the trees, then shrugged and bent back to his work. But the moment carried weight. Suspicion had been planted. The next time, they would look harder. The rancher leaned close to the woman. We cannot wait much longer. Every stake they drive cuts deeper. She nodded, her breath clouding the cold. The moment is near. We will know it when it comes. They pulled back into the trees, hearts pounding. The valley felt tighter now, as if the land itself strained under the weight of the new posts. Each path they took seemed filled with choices. To strike too soon was to risk losing everything. To wait too long was to let the valley slip away. Without a fight by the time they returned to the shelter, the sky had cleared, hard blue stretching forever. The uncle set down his bundle and looked at them both. They will bring more men tomorrow. Once the posts stand in full circle, The law will call it a boundary. After that, even fire cannot clear it without a cost. The rancher felt his chest tighten. Then we strike before tomorrow. The woman's gaze was steady, though shadows lay in her eyes. Yes, tonight, when the valley belongs only to itself. The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the dim air. Plans were drawn, whispered, tested against the memory of the land. Each word carried the weight of generations, of river shifting, of fences raised and broken. The valley waited, holding its breath, as men prepared to decide its fate. The rancher lay awake as night fell, staring at the roof beams, listening to the storm of his own heartbeat. Outside, the snow gleamed pale under the moon, and down by the creek, lanterns still burned where the company worked. The stakes gleamed like teeth in the frost. He closed his eyes, knowing dawn would bring the clash he could no longer delay. The land, the water, the shelter, her family, his own blood, all balanced on the edge of what would come. The valley held still, waiting for the gate to open, waiting for the first sound of hooves or the first crack of defiance. The suspense wound tighter. Every breath of wind another turn of the rope. And as the night deepened, the rancher knew the next hours would lead him straight into the heart of the storm. The night seemed endless, yet when the first pale light of dawn touched the ridges, the valley stirred with a strange stillness. The rancher rose, his body tense with the weight of the choice he had long avoided. The woman sat by the fire, her hair loose, her face set with calm determination. The uncle stood at the door, scanning the horizon where lanterns still glowed faint against the fading stars. They had agreed the night before that silence could not last. Action was no longer a question. The creek's edge was alive with movement. Company men stood around their wagons, stamping their feet against the cold, checking ropes, tightening stakes that cut into frozen earth. The posts they planted looked proud and final, as though already they had forgotten whose valley they stood in. One man carried the tall paper roll under his arm, pausing now and then to check against the ground. Another barked orders, his voice steady with practiced authority. These men did not think they could be opposed. They believed only ink and steel decided land. The rancher watched from the ridge, his heart pounding in rhythm with the hammer blows. Below, the woman placed her hand on his arm, steadying him. "We are not alone," she whispered, and she was right. Her uncle had spent the night calling others, quiet families from camps along the valley, neighbors who had little but who understood the cost of losing water and earth. By sunrise, shadows moved behind the trees, figures stepping out one by one. They carried no flags, no seals, but they brought presents, and presents mattered. The rancher stepped forward, boots crunching on frost. He walked down the slope, each step heavy with years of silence breaking. When he reached the edge of the camp, the men looked up. Their laughter stopped. The man with the papers adjusted his coat, masking his surprise with a tight smile. "Good morning," the man said smoothly. "We thought you might see reason today. You can sign, and all will be set fair. You will be paid. Your troubles with this hard land can end." The rancher looked at him, then at the posts that cut into the creek bed. His voice came slow but steady. "This land is not for you to sell or buy. Your posts have no roots here. They stand on lies." The man's smile faltered. "You speak as if words can undo law. We carry signatures, seals, rights granted by those above us. This is already settled." The woman stepped from the trees, her eyes clear as the river ice. Settled? Settled by whom? Settled by those who never stood in this valley, who never drank from its streams or buried their dead in its soil. Your papers are hollow. They carry no weight here. The other family stepped forward, forming a ring around the camp. Silent at first, then speaking, their voices rose like the wind through the pines. One told of cattle raised from calves along these banks. Another spoke of children born by the cottonwoods. The uncle raised his staff and spoke of generations who had hunted, planted, and remembered this land when no surveyor dared step into its winters. The rancher pulled the badge from his pocket, holding it high. It glinted in the pale sun. The men stared at it, uncertain. He had found it left behind, a mark of their company's authority, but now it served a different purpose. "This badge proves nothing but trespass," he said. "You left it where you had no right to be. You use it to claim power, but power that hides in shadows has no honor." The leader's face reddened, his smooth words breaking into anger. "You think voices can stop us? You think standing here with your neighbors will change what is written?" He raised the roll of paper high. "This is binding." The rancher took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the man's, then let the valley itself decide. With one sharp motion, he seized the post nearest him and pulled. The frozen earth cracked, the stake ripping free. He hurled it aside. The sound echoed like thunder across the ridges. The company men shouted, some reaching for weapons, but the crowd surged forward, not with violence but with force of numbers. They pulled posts from the ground, one after another, tearing down the circle meant to cage the creek. The lanterns toppled, their light spilling and dying in the snow. The papers slipped from the leader's hand, pages scattering into the wind. Spinning across the frozen water, the woman bent to the ground, pressing her palm against the earth. "This valley remembers," she said, her voice carrying far. "No. Paper can rewrite its memory." The leader, red-faced and shaken, looked around at the ring of people. His men hesitated, their earlier certainty crumbling under the weight of so many eyes. At last he spat into the snow, rage twisted in his face. "This is not the end. You think today matters, but the company will not forget. We will return." The rancher stepped closer, his voice low but clear. "Then when you return, remember this: the land is not empty. It has people, voices, and a truth deeper than your ink. If you come again, you will find the same answer." The company men gathered their wagons, their anger simmering but their confidence broken. They turned their horses and rode out, leaving tracks in the snow that would soon fade. The valley stood quiet again, the creek flowing free, the stakes gone. For a long moment no one moved. Then the uncle lifted his staff high, and the families raised their voices together. A cry not of victory but of survival, of defiance that carried across the frozen hills. The rancher felt the sound in his chest, heavy and true. He had not wanted to be part of this fight, but the valley had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. In the days that followed, the posts were burned, the ground smoothed, and the creek left to run without marks. The badge was placed in the fire, metal twisting, proof that false authority held no place here. The woman's family returned to their camp, and the neighbors back to their homes. But bonds had been forged stronger than fences. The valley had united in a way it never had before. The rancher and the woman stood together by the water one evening as the sun dipped behind the ridges. The storm had passed, but the memory of danger lingered. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "They may come again," she said softly. He nodded. "Then we will stand again. Together." For the first time in years, he felt the weight of solitude lift. He had carried the valley alone, believing silence could keep peace. But peace was not found in silence. It was found in standing, in joining voices with others, in refusing to bow to those who thought distance and paper gave them the right to rule. The uncle's words carried with him, "Land without memory is only dirt, but land with memory is alive." The rancher looked across the valley and saw more than earth. He saw stories, sweat, roots, and promises, each bound into the soil. That was worth defending. As spring came, the snow melted into streams that sang through the valley. Green returned to the hills, and the cattle grazed by waters free of stakes. At night the fire glowed warm, and the shelter no longer felt like a cage but a home. The woman's laughter softened the silence, and the rancher found himself no longer alone in his waiting. The valley endured. The company had left behind only broken posts and scraps of paper, while the people remained, their bond stronger than before. And though he knew new storms would rise someday, the rancher no longer feared them. For he understood now that the valley's strength was not his alone to carry. It lived in every voice that rose to defend it. In the quiet of one evening, as the stars spread across the sky, the rancher whispered to the land itself, "We are still here." And the wind through the pines seemed to answer, steady and certain, carrying the promise that as long as people stood for it, the valley would never be taken. That night he sat by the fire, the woman beside him, the uncle, resting near the door. The crackle of wood, the calm of the land, the strength of voices joined together, all these were the resolution the valley had needed. Not a single man's fight, not a company's claim, but a living chorus that proved. Memory was stronger than ink, and so the story closed not with silence, but with presence. The valley was whole, the people were united, and the rancher no longer walked alone. The land remained, carrying its memory forward, ready to endure whatever came next. And in that truth lay the final reflection: home is not something granted by papers or badges. It is written in the living bond between land and people, and no storm, no company, no false claim can erase it.